Welcome everybody to the Fellows Colloquium. And we're excited to have guest speaker Suzanne Blier at this concluding session of this series. Current fellow David Bindman will be introducing Professor Blier. David Weinman is Emeritus Durning Lawrence Professor of the History of Art at University College London. He is the author of many important works, including Blake as an Artist, Roubiliac and the 18th Century Monument, which was the winner of the 1996 Mitchell Prize. He is also co-author with Henry Louis Gates Jr. of the series The Image of the Black in Western Art. His current book-length projects include Art and Scientific Racism in the 19th Century, as well as The Image of the Black in Latin America and the Caribbean. Please welcome David Bindman.
Okay, thank you, Krishna. It's a great honor and pleasure to introduce my colleague and good friend, Suzanne Preston Blier, the Alan Whitehill Clowes Professor of Fine Arts and Professor of African and African American Studies here at Harvard University. However, it's a difficult task, for to introduce her career properly would leave no time for her talk. Put simply, Suzanne is the most energetic and productive person I've ever encountered, and I wonder if she finds time to sleep at all, or even there might be triplets who are sharing the work. First of all, she's a great teacher, and I've had the privilege of teaching a joint course with her and working with her as co-editor along with Skip Gates, of The Image of the Black in African and Asian Art, and with Vera Grant, The Art of Jazz, Form Performance Notes in 2017. I will pass over her deep involvement in local politics, her marathon morning runs, and her Facebook contributions to concentrate on her enormous contribution to the history of African art and architecture. She's the author of numerous books that are major contributions to her fields of specialization. And the only way to keep it manageable is to select a few highlights from a long, dynamic and distinguished scholarly career. The Anatomy of Architecture, Ontology and Metaphor in Batamaliba Architectural Expression, published in 1987, won the Arnold Rubin Prize. Her second book, African Vodoun, Art, Psychology and Power, received the 1996 Charles Rufus Murray Prize from the College Art Association. African Royal Art, The Majesty of Form, won the 1998 Choice Book Award. Art and Risk in Ancient Yoruba, Ife History, Power and Identity, circa 1300, published in 2015, won the Prose Annual Award for the best publication in the field of art history and criticism. In 2019, Picasso's Demoiselles, The Untold Origins of a Modern Art Masterpiece, which we'll hear about today, was a finalist for the 2020 Prose Prize in Art History and Criticism. And forthcoming is her latest book project, 1325, How Medieval Africa Made the World Modern. I can't even begin to mention the numerous articles she's produced over the years, but to give an idea of the esteem in which she is held by her professional colleagues, in 2011, two of her articles were selected by the Centennial Anthology of the Art Bulletin to be among the 33 top articles of the journal's 100-year history. And she was one of only 3 art historians, along with Maya Shapiro and Leo Steinberg, to have 2 articles included. I can only briefly list some of the fellowships she's received. These include Guggenheim, Radcliffe, Getty, NEH, Fulbright Fellowships, and the Mellon Senior Fellowship at CASVA, the National Gallery of Art. In conclusion, the one honor I can't resist mentioning is that Suzanne had bestowed on her the Yoruba chieftaincy title, and pardon my pronunciation, Otun Yeye Obulafon, first right mother of Obulafon, for her work on Ife art and history. Please welcome my tireless colleague and friend, Suzanne Blier.
Thank you so much, David. I wish you were here and so we could greet one another properly, but that was really lovely. And I owe so much to you and your brilliance as a colleague and an editor. What I'd like to do today is to talk about this book, how it came to be written, and how and where this whole engagement goes from here. And simply to highlight a few key points along the way. One of them has to do with the structure of the book itself and the process of writing and how we finally were able to bring it in print. And that involved the use of fair use, which I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer period. And it, in many respects, complements my deep interest in looking at the co-relationship between Africa and Europe over the longue durée, including this new book that I'm working on. And then subsequent to Picasso's Demoiselles, I've been interested in re-exploring Picasso from the vantage point of the era of surrealism. So I'm going to touch on that subject in particular in the course of today's talk. Before I begin, what I'd like to do is to read you a bit from chapter 2 and then move through some of the slides that take us from here to where I'm going in my research. And in this section, I want you to be focusing particularly on the photograph in the middle. And this chapter begins with a visit that I made to the Museum of Modern Art in New York to talk with Michael Duffy, the conservator who had then recently helped to restore the painting. So let me start. Michael Duffy had had a dream. The details of this dream were described in a New Yorker article that accompanied the announcement of Les Demoiselles' reemergence from its cleaning in time for its 2007 centennial. Duffy had dreamed that one day he'd arrived in his lab to see a corner of the large 8-foot by 7-foot canvas magically peeled back to reveal the layers of pigment that lay beneath the surface. Quote, it was as if the figures were trying to come to life, end of quote, he explained to journalist Calvin Tompkins. He's not the only person to have been haunted by Les Demoiselles. MoMA curator Kirk Varnado revealed that this work had given him shivers, end of quote. Picasso's photographer Bois noted similarly that on one occasion, quote, Les Demoiselles gave me the eye. What are these women looking for? End of quote. Contemporary artists such as Fred Wilson and Armando Marino, to say nothing of Faith Ringgold, have reimagined the canvas from the vantage of either seeing or stepping inside the work to explore it more fully, or recontextualizing it in the context of issues around women more generally. For Wilson, this comes by way of an African Songhai mask positioned over the crouching demoiselle's face, whose eyes can be seen through the canvas. For Marino's engagement, we see the figure of a barefoot black man wearing red shorts and African beads lifting up the lower right corner of the canvas to climb inside. I don't recall experiencing any specific dream while researching Les Demoiselles, but my encounter with this painting often occurred in equally subversive ways. As noted in the introduction to my book, the 5 women populating the canvas have come to life in unique ways for me. Insights often arrived in the form of gifts of knowledge that were seemingly laid before me in a series of clues that challenged me to pursue them directly to the canvas. Most importantly, they included an array of new sources for the work, one book, and then another book, and then 2 more books, then the 1907 photograph that we see here. In my work as an Africanist, I am accustomed to dealing with the notion of ghosts, artful and non-artful apparitions that are part of the broad sweep of inventive cultural practices. Moreover, in the case of Les Demoiselles, as with art in general, I believe that the created work itself holds key insights into the processes of its creation and its meaning. It is up to us as scholars and viewers to discover what these women mean. In the end, whatever the culture or period in play, it is imperative that we look closely at and behind the image to see the work on its own terms. In my case, it was not only a question of closer examination of the painting, but also of throwing out most everything that had been written about it in order to engage it anew. In some ways, this has been a challenge, since Les Demoiselles and the hundreds of studies and related works associated with it have been meticulously examined over the last century, scrutinized, analyzed, researched, and then re-examined by scores of scholars, art historians, curators, popular writers, scientists, and others. Rarely did Picasso provide overt spoken or written clues about his artworks, much less so for his most iconic paintings. However, with the photograph of Les Demoiselles that was taken soon after Picasso began the canvas in his studio, photography sometimes plays an important role in understanding his works. And this photograph certainly did as well. So familiar are we with Les Demoiselles that it's hard to reimagine it with fresh eyes. In this canvas, Picasso has introduced us to a quintet of nude and minimally attired women. Among the significant details unveiled in the studio photograph is the fact that the two women on the right may have been the first to be worked out in detail and not, as many until now have believed, the result of later alterations. The two African mask-wearing demoiselles were a key part of the work from the very beginning of Picasso's application of pigment to the canvas. While this photograph was first published over 40 years ago, in 1975, and has since been republished several times, no one to date has noticed the glaring discrepancy between the evidence found in this image and the various theories put forward by Picasso scholars who have insisted, seemingly without exception, that Picasso repainted the canvas at some later point, effacing the two figures on the right and repainting them with African-like masks. Seeing the photographic evidence, we have little choice but to throw out these theories for the canvas based on the belief that Picasso dramatically repainted the faces of what others have understood to be 5 Caucasian women to make them Black. Where does this leave us? Here too, the studio photograph offers more clues. It was in large measure as a result of this photograph that brought me to MoMA to discuss the painting with Duffy. In it, we see a still relatively incomplete canvas that includes parts of the faces of all 5 of the female protagonists. We can see here as well, posed directly in front of Picasso's canvas, Kees van Dagen's daughter, the young Augusta or Dolly van Dagen. She stands on a chair balanced by the arm of her mother, Auguste Goose van Dagen. Picasso may well have taken the photograph. He certainly would have been there when it was made. He also likely played a critical role in arranging Gus and posing Dolly in the chair in the middle of the canvas in such a way that they frame but do not entirely obscure the faces of the 5 demoiselles. And let me interject here outside of the text that this photograph is coupled with another taken in 1908 by Picasso of Dolly and her mother in front of 3 women, and Les Demoiselles is rolled up in a corner of it. And in the 1908 photograph, the 2 women are showed in summer attire, Dolly with sandals and with lighter colored dresses. And that led me to one of the most important clues of this painting, the date that it was painted. Most scholars today identify Les Demoiselles as from June or July in 1907. But since the 2 women here are shown in winter attire, dark clothing, it means that they are photographed before Easter, because as anyone of a certain age knows, it was at Easter that women would change to summer attire. And thanks in part to Google, we can learn that in 1907, Easter took place in late March 1907. And so from that, I was able to delineate the actual date of the painting on a Tuesday night, the last week of March. But to get back to the text itself, in part based on this photograph, I think we can see the painting in a new light. And in this way, it's not only the painting, but also women more generally as progenitors that began to speak to me. It was as if by this very image, this photograph, that the artist was offering one of the many clues into the meaning of this painting. Picasso, who was very reticent to talk about his oeuvre later, sometimes used other canvases, drawings, or photography to do so, kind of as a coda of this larger engagement. So what we're seeing here really are the 5 women plus these 2 other women, the mothers and the daughters. At this juncture, at this stage in the canvas, understood in part through this photograph, we can see in some that rather than transforming the right-hand women, Picasso's begun to engage them as linked to Africa. Indeed, he makes them less horrifying, less like reptiles, and much more human-like in his engagement with them. And it is in part from this vantage point that I think that we can begin to see in part how the painting itself can be understood in a new way. In their earlier features, the 2 women suggest that Picasso was engaging questions of evolution, transitions from reptiles to humans, the origins of the world populations, time, temporal transformations, ancestry, generations here through women, and the role sex played in all of this, from sexual acts to mothers and to new generations. Stein's perceptions regarding the canvas are important here, Gertrude Stein's. As Pierre Day notes, Gertrude Stein was the first to understand the true subject of the Demoiselles in its composition and the shift of vision the composition imposed. Quote, Picasso said, "Look at that face. All the faces are as old as the world." And it's from this vantage point that I want to offer a bit more insights into the canvas and then look where we go from here. And beginning with this drawing on the left of the Parisian and exotic figures, to note that for Picasso, all humans, all women were the same once one had basically removed their fashionable attire. And that is in part what he's evoking here in the sketch on the left with various of these other figures. It was not only the photograph, but even before then, my discovery of books that led me to do this, book in its own right. And I will say it was a kind of an interesting thing. I never wanted to write this book. And I will say I fought it for a long period of time. I just finished the previous book on art and risk in ancient Yoruba, and had gone to the Tauser Library at the Peabody Museum to check out a book by a German anthropologist named Leo Frobenius to just double check the German sources, and pulled out a book that was adjacent to it, a book that I had read in graduate school in German called Die Masken und Geheimbände, Masks and Secret Societies from Africa. And as I opened it up, I began to realize that those were the sources, most likely for Les Demoiselles. No other scholar had seen this, I think in part because we've been so focused on French sources and otherwise. But I looked at that, I actually took the book out and brought it home, and I compared it to some of the drawings that had been done after the Primitivism in Modern Art exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in 1984, and kind of put it aside as a thing of interest. And a little bit later, I was working on a book, still incomplete, on the Amazons of Dahomey, the women warriors, and went to the library to get another book in which a photograph that I'll show you appeared. That book was not in Widener, it was in the medical school library. And I said, okay, fine, and took it out and opened it up. And I said, I can see why this is in the medical school library. It was a volume with photographs of women from around the world, largely nude, in semi-evolutionary order. It's a stunningly problematic book. But as I was looking through it for that one image, which wasn't in that edition, so I ended up purchasing one of my own, I began to realize that Picasso had seen this book as well. And by the end of this work, I'd realized that I had found at least 4 that were important to him. And it's not so much that they were important and that he was using books, but that they together offer new insights into the painting. But just to give you an example from the Frobenius, what we're seeing here are illustrations by a Swiss artist of masks from Africa. This was part of Frobenius's dissertation. Beautifully rendered watercolor drawings, as well as sketches in profile and frontal view. And as I began to look at them, I began to see real complements with some of the studies that Picasso was doing for Les Demoiselles. For example, on this, I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, but the Congo mask here, the lines which extend at a diagonal from the eyes, or the dots around the mouth that we find in this other drawing on the bottom right, or this other study by Picasso on the lower right. And the reason that this is important is because this use of books, when Bill Rubin put together the Primitivism and Modern Art exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, his intention was to find the actual African works that were important for Picasso and other modernists. And one of the things that was most striking about that exhibit was that he never found the works. Indeed, a French scholar who wrote for the catalog noted that all of the principal African masks that scholars had assumed that Picasso must have seen were not available in Paris at the time. So what could he have used? Finding this book provides one key clue to that, and indeed would have provided Picasso with a more intimate close-up and long durée engagement with these works than otherwise would have been possible. As I was in the Tauser Library looking at the book, it was one of the first color lithograph publications. And one of the things I had to do was to lift up the tracing paper protections for the color lithographs themselves. And on those, you can see line drawings of the masks, which offer another way of engaging with Picasso around this book. Frobenius not only included those, but also was himself interested in the evolution of masks from African mask to human form. And that idea of evolution of Africa to modern humans is something that engaged Picasso as well. But one of the things that one can see here in the image from the Congo on the lower left that was clearly critical for his understanding of the crouching demoiselle is it was not just the form of the mask that Picasso engaged, but also the color palette. And that also was something that scholars have queried over, because around this time he's switching to a set of colors that are much more appropriate for what was happening in Germany at this time. And that too likely came through this particular volume. And this book would engage him over much of his career. He comes back to it. But what I found also very interesting was that he used images from this book, African Masks, to engage in the portraits of key people who were important to him in this period. And I think I could say as well, those who actually got the African piece of it. So here we have Wilhelm Ude, who was a close friend and later dealer, framed around an Ogoni mask from Nigeria. The same thing I would argue is true of Gertrude Stein, who, as is now well known, Picasso's portrait of her, he spent many, many hours and many, many sittings trying to capture her likeness, then went away to the summer of 1906 to Spain and came back, effaced the whole of it, and rendered her physiognomy basically in part on memory. But you can also see here, in my view, the close resonances with Bundu masks from the Mende of Sierra Leone, referencing powerful women in a way, much as Gertrude Stein did as well. The second book was a book written by a Vienna-born scientist, actually a medical doctor. The first gynecologist is how we understand him today through Wikipedia. He wrote a number of volumes, essentially compilations of photographs from women around the world, along with accurate diagrams of their bodies, proportionally accurate. And he was of interest for many reasons, not only as a scientist, but also as a promoter of some of the pretty horrendous kinds of race theories that were being perpetuated, not just in the German-speaking world, but also in Europe and in the US in the decades that followed. The first of his books were written and published in the late 1890s, and they went through multiple editions into the 19-teens. He provides maps, such as the one on the left, showing what he considers to be the evolution of humankind, and a diagram here on the right, where, as you can see, he goes through the 5 main races, and including a division of Europe into Southern Europe, Roman, and Northern Europe, German, ending up appropriately in Denmark along this pretty vile trajectory where he spent the latter part of his career. But what's interesting here in thinking about this and thinking about Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is how the whole theme of evolution is playing out in 1907 when he painted it. That's the first year that the Sorbonne had a professor of evolution. It's also a time soon after the turn of the century, where people were rethinking the world in light of the colonial intervention, where people came from, where people emerged, and how the various races and ethnicities were being correlated together. And I think it is that larger question that was especially important for Picasso. It's a massive canvas, an enormous one, and one that, based on its scale alone, one cannot imagine Picasso envisioning that as a simple brothel scene. Nor, as we look at it, can we even imagine why Picasso would have placed, for example, an Egyptian figure walking in profile in Egyptian style across the canvas. Pieces of it simply do not fit. And indeed, what he has done that makes it so unique is to create each of these women in the style of art known for the major periods in which these women are representing, whether it's the most ancient or so-called primitive population crossing between Africa and Oceania, or the so-called African population, largely sub-Saharan Africa, the standing figure on the right versus the crouching figure on the left, or the Egyptian figure who emerges also with South Asia in a kind of soft attire characteristic of that area, or the images of European women, Caucasians, Northern and Southern. It's in part about the origin of the world more generally. Concomitant in some ways with Courbet's L'Origine du Monde here in the painting on the left, and also works by 2 of his important competitors at the time, among these Henri Matisse. So it's a work that engages on multiple levels. And that too takes us back to what I think is probably among the first of the books that Picasso was using in this period, a book by the British traveler Richard Burton, who well known in the Mideast certainly, but also went to the kingdom of Dahomey prior to its colonization by the French. He was fascinated with Amazons, as were many people, and you can see his illustration of an Amazon in the front piece of the book. And Picasso has taken that and flipped it as the central figure, serving fruit in his dance Barbar, the dance of Salome, flip-flopped as he would often do things. And what I would point out here as well, in terms of Picasso's complicated relationship with Africa, on the one hand, he shows the kind of really pretty horrific physiognomic references to Africans as in some way lower on a environmental chain that was ubiquitous, actually, in Europe in key parts of the 19th century. At the same time, in other ways, he's showing great respect for them, in part by insisting later in this work that what they're creating are indeed artworks on par, if not even superior to those within the Western canon. And this is the photograph of Dahomey women that Strauss publishes that I had gone to see, a composition somewhat resonant with Les Demoiselles itself. And from Strauss is interested in photographs of women in various poses. It was a book widely purchased and used by artists. One no longer needed to have living models. One could use the models here posed in various contexts, very similar to the classical and later statuary and paintings that Picasso and others would have known well. Frankly, living models are a pain. They're expensive. They want to move. They get cold, and still models are far easier. But Strauss is also interested in things such as the circulatory system and how that is working. And so we can see elements of this that come into play in Picasso's own interest. And indeed, his proportions of figures change pretty dramatically as a result of looking at this, with so many of the figures in Strauss coming from places such as Asia. And I'm showing in the lower right this image in part because Picasso clearly was looking at several of these books at the same time. He was doing studies for Les Demoiselles in 1906, late 1906 and early 1907. So we can see the sailor on the bottom, and here a reversal of the figure in the middle on the left. The last of the books that was important was a medieval book by Vera showing diagrams for sculptors and architects of the 13th century. Interestingly enough, it had a new edition had been shown, been published in 1906, apparently to thunderous success. And one can see here Picasso in part appropriating elements from it, and look in particular at the ostriches here and the figure of ostriches here. And that idea of kind of transformation of these figures is especially important. So on the right, taking the ponytail of a woman, and we know he was creating those sketches in October of 1906, a ponytail into the tail of a fox, into other birds. So that idea of evolution and transformation here engaged as well. He wrote poetry around this time, including one here with a study for Les Demoiselles in the words j'aurais, and this idea of sort of germination and death and spring and rebirth more generally. Again, themes of evolution, evoking also the work of Émile Zola. And two of the most important works clearly for him at this time were André Derain and Henri Matisse, whose works were being shown at the exposition in Paris. Actually the opening was several days before he began applying pigment to the canvas. And both of these are scenes of evolution, women either emerging from the muck of the beginning of time or emerging from the sand of an oasis, as in Henri Matisse's Blue Nude. And we can see this just going back in time with things such as his Harlequin, that scholars have long assumed to be a rather simple circus scene with a mother and child and the father. But once one re-looks at this simian figure sitting on the floor and looking up at them, we can begin to see this also as, in many respects, his engagement with evolution more generally. Whether it's art evolution from mass to forms, from simple forms to more complex ones, I think there's an awful lot of this element of evolution in play in his work. And it's complicated in many respects by Picasso's own history. One of the things that I learned as a result of this work was that Picasso was closely related to individuals in Cuba who were not of European descent. His grandfather certainly was, but he was stationed in Cuba when the Spanish were there, and either married or had a relationship with a local woman of African descent, had 4 children. And one of these is pictured here. So Picasso knew that he was in part, related to the continent of Africa in various means. And that's also in part through the city of his birth, Malaga, which is in many respects still an African city. It's very close to the major port to North Africa. And you can see the word Malaga written in this drawing for a standing figure. That's one of the works from this period. And I would simply add that in this time period for Picasso, Africa meant as much a place of hardship, of hunger, and in that he was also in some ways sharing this idea. Picasso was looking also at other kinds of works. He was certainly looking at actual works of African art, and no doubt the most important was this Vili figure on the left, rather Teke figure on the left from the Congo. And a figure shown with its arms drawn up to the mouth. And there's a really fascinating story told through the lens of various tellers. Picasso arriving at either the apartment of Matisse or Gertrude Stein, most likely Matisse, when Matisse had recently purchased this figure, and Picasso handling it, engaging with it, its arms, its face, the whole of the figure for much of the evening, and then going home. And the next morning, his friends arrive, and strewn across the floor are various drawings of strange looking women with a large ear. And that is in many respects the really beginning of his close work, October 1906, on this canvas. And he had made enough money the previous April by selling the bulk of his extant work that was still in his collection to a dealer. So he had enough money to live on, paying the rent, buying enough food for the next year or year and a half. And he put that to good use in simply deciding no longer to paint for patrons and simply to rediscover art himself. And speaking of this in part, Matisse in 1908 does a kind of homage to Picasso in his Bathers, where you can see one of the bathers with the same kind of hand gesture to the mouth of this figure, looking at a tortoise, an animal that moves from sort of water to land in a way very simplified, but addressing the same kind of form. This was not the first time Picasso had seen African art. He represented Spain at the Exposition Universelle in 1900, where on view in the Dahomey Pavilion, which was very popular that year, were a number of works from the Kingdom of Dahomey in the Republic of Benin. One of them would have been this work, which was there. He also would have seen in the Trocadero some works of art, including this fabulous iron assemblage work of Dahomey, showing the god of war and iron, creativity and destruction, Gu. And his good friend, Guillaume Apollinaire, had himself acquired a Dahomey work around this time, a work referencing a bird with a fish in its mouth and seemingly a snake or a worm. And Apollinaire's name for Picasso was l'oiseau du Benin, the bird of Benin. So for Apollinaire, there was also this close connection between Picasso and Africa during this period. Picasso likely also in the Trocadero would have seen works such as these enormous figures of royals, themselves based on European sculptures of saints that were commissioned by the Dahomey king from Europe and then reimagined in the form of the icons of these kings. This for King Bahazan, the last of the Dahomey kings on the throne. Before the French intervention. And this work, like a number of others, are going back to Benin now. But we know Picasso was looking in the flesh, so to speak, at a number of works from works, antique works, from classical works, Roman era works from Spain, to a mask that I discovered in the Louvre that was available at the time, of an Egyptian mask that probably was the source for the mask of the Egyptian figure. He was looking broadly, and if the mask didn't exactly come from the Trocadero that he had seen, certainly other works had. He was interested in the popular press, as were his friends, and was collecting these. And one of the most fascinating subjects in it at this time was the conquest of Dahomey and Dahomey culture itself. So that certainly would have reified this interest. And questions have been raised about the men shown in the various studio drawings for Les Demoiselles. There's a standing man on the left holding either a book or a skull. And there's a seated figure generally identified as a sailor, the standing man generally identified as a doctor. And while some scholars had seen the doctor as representing somebody who would treat syphilis, something that Picasso was known to be afraid of, and that actually is the theory in part behind why some imagine he would have effaced the two women on the right out of some kind of fear of death. But to my view, it's not only a kind of racist notion that Picasso somehow in some kind of fear or trauma of death would have transformed the face of females into African masks, but it also frankly doesn't make much sense within the context of this larger work. In my view, the standing figure is probably the Dr. Strauss himself with either a book or a skull. He was deeply interested in the measuring of physiognomies. And the sailor most likely represents an anthropologist, much like Leo Frobenius, if not Leo Frobenius himself, whose main means of transport to these areas was by ship. The post-history of this painting is as fascinating and as important as is its own history. And simply to point out several others, I'll say that in many respects, the death of Picasso in 1973 was really important for artists. At once, for once, they were able to really take up ideas about Picasso in new and very creative ways. And we also, there's a fascinating cross-currency between Picasso and Africa, as in this wonderful work by Sherry Samba. What is the future of our art? And in this case, lamenting the fact that the principal dealers sign these artists up to such steep contracts that they've got no freedom really of expression. And that was something that Sherry Samba, among others, explored. Of course, there are other issues too. And when there was a recent exhibit of Picasso's work in South Africa, the question turned in part to, well, Picasso was stealing works from Africa, the imagery from African art to create his own oeuvre and his own reputation. And while that's certainly true, I come at this with a slightly more nuanced take, which is he was really the first to see African art, as something that was on par with, that was indeed, should be celebrated and looked at, scrutinized, engaged with far more closely in many respects than the legacy of Western art that so far had captured the imagination of artists of his day. And from there, I've gone forward, and I just want to show you a couple of slides to the Surrealist period and the journal Minotaur, where we get a co-joining also of Africa and Europe, and here with Michel Léry, who was a key figure in this. In the first two editions of Minotaur, the famous Dakar, Djibouti trip from West Africa to East Africa, and a series of really important articles framed by some of the key scholars in the field. So that cross-currency between anthropology and thinking about sort of art criticism and other forms, that this has been explored in various ways, but I think it can be enriched further by looking at these real cross-currencies. And even the selection of objects for these editions speak to what they were looking for in Africa from the vantage point of photography and finding complements with what was happening, the kind of aesthetic interests in place in Europe. Picasso at one point actually took his hand to carving the two works on the left, but my thinking is that he found it incredibly difficult. I mean, the art of wood carving is incredibly complicated. You have to have real strength, but finesse so that you don't break off an arm. And this is a pretty rudimentary carving on the left of Picasso, as important as it might be. I'm comparing that with a pretty well-known Dogon carving of the sort that were celebrated in the Minotaur magazine. What happened in the 30s, though, late 1920s and 30s, was Picasso did take up sculpture in an important way, in a new way, but through works of assemblage, works that owe as much to the early engagement with Africa. Images from Frobenius here, as well as other works that he had seen. And I think it is in these works that we can see Picasso rethinking art anew. Also, the impact of funerals and bones and kind of the essential elements of life and the experience of life come into play in Picasso's own rethinking of anatomy, in part looking at the cross-currency between Africa and Picasso during this period. And his memorial for Apollinaire, a model for it, which we see in the center, clearly draws from the bird with a fish, the oiseau de Benin, and he's engaging these similar kinds of imagery in his drawings and other creative works from this period. A later monument, similarly going back to some of these elements as he goes forward. And simply to say that assemblage also has important roots in Africa. And as we go forward and think about Picasso, I think it's important at key moments to understand he turned to Africa, whether it was Guernica, in which he's most certainly drawing on a grisaille, a black, white, and gray painting, or rendering of a wall painting in Africa, or whether it's in other forms. Obviously, he's drawing from many sources, but this is one. And coming back later into the 50s and later to some of the forms of expression that he found particularly powerful there. And simply to add, I'm almost at the last slide, that we often think about Picasso and women. I mean, he was in relatively stable relationships, and certainly during the period in which he painted Les Demoiselles. But to my mind, it's also his relationships with powerful figure, regardless of gender. And whether it was Apollinaire, or whether it was Malraux or André Matin or others, I think that this is a piece of it. And I think it's important because the whole legacy of Malraux, who published his conversations with Picasso after Picasso's death, and speak to this mystical engagement at the Trocadero with the smells that are waffling up, and Picasso's turn to this kind of image of exoticism and danger in Africa. I think there's a lot of fiction in that. I mean, Malraux was a wonderful novelist and an interesting art theorist, but he was also creating a reputation for himself. And I think for Picasso, the books tell a quite different and equally important story about looking at foundations and relationships between Europe and the West. I think that that's really an important element to keep in mind, is how he enjoyed these relationships and built on them over the course of his career. And that would include Francis Bacon as well. And simply to conclude here, to say that as we think about Picasso, think about Les Demoiselles, and think forward to the decades that followed, I think it's important, particularly with Picasso, to provide ourselves with the opportunities to look back at Africa in his work and to see the resonance that it held for him, the important insights that it continued to offer him as he was trying to reinvent and actually rethink the world of global art history as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you very much. David, would you like to respond first before we get to questions from the audience?
Yes, I would. Yes, a fascinating talk. And I was very struck again looking at the Demoiselles that there are actually 5 women there. And that corresponds, I suppose, to the what is, I suppose, the most authoritative number of races in racial theory. In fact, it goes back to Blumenbach. And I'm wondering, first of all, if perhaps Picasso started at least with the idea of showing the races of the world, and then maybe adapted it and, as you say, brought in questions of evolution, which would not necessarily be incompatible with that theory. I think particularly the very obviously Egyptian figure, because Egypt is very much in debate in the later 19th century, and the simple question were the Egyptians white or not, or were they African or not. And it seems to me that debate, there seems to be at least bits and pieces of those sort of debates still lingering in that painting. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really great point. To go back to the initial part of your question, when he began this series of studies in 1906 in October, I don't think he knew at that juncture what it would become. And certainly there are other artists whose works he was exploring. Most importantly, in my view, Cezanne, but Cezanne was not the only one. But the idea of bathers, I think, was really critical. One of the images I didn't show here from Strauss actually shows two women, a white woman, a photograph, a white woman and a woman of African descent meeting at the juncture of a doorway. And it's quite, and that actually seems to be the source for his painting Two Women, which the original sketches for which show one white woman and one Black woman. And then later, when the painting itself is done, there are two white women who are engaging with each other. And so my sense at that juncture, at least Two Women, and that's the fall of 1906, is probably it's still in this kind of bather mode. But as this canvas was so important for him, he really wanted it to transform his career. He wanted it once and for all, to beat Derain, to beat Matisse and everybody else. And I think it's at that juncture when he began to think about a very large canvas that this expanded to a much bigger theme. And that's where the ideas that you're presenting here, I think, come in so saliently. And I have no doubt that he was aware of this. One of the things that I think that we underestimate for Picasso was that he was a real intellect. And he sought out and did his best work in conjunction with friends of his who were intellects, whether it was Gertrude Stein or any number of other people. And these were individuals who were deeply immersed in scientific theories of the period. So I think you're absolutely on target.
Thank you. Our current fellow, Bill Schwartz, has a related question. He says, a beautiful work of reconstruction. Thank you, Suzanne. I've never thought of evolution in the various ways you use to underwrite your interpretation. I'm interested, though, in how you read Picasso's own take on evolution in Demoiselles.
That's a great question. I do think, I would say, and here I'm expressing my views as opposed to what I think are necessarily coming from the painting, not that one can excise the author from the work to that extent, but I do think that considering the importance of both Strauss and Frobenius to Picasso, that he did believe that there was some kind of evolution. And that it was certainly complicated, but I do feel that he must have grappled with that to some extent. What's interesting here is to draw on Leo Frobenius to add that piece to it. So what made Leo Frobenius's work important in this period is that he was arguing for cultural circles and history, and using, by circles, I mean sort of areas, regions of cultural primacy, cultural principles, I should say, in Africa. And the reason that this is important, I mean, although Frobenius at this point is pretty outmoded, is that up until that time, Africa was seen to be a place with zero history for the most part. It was simply whatever was made as a work of art, what we would call art, what are artworks, in 1907 were seen to be pretty much identical to what would have been made by Africans in the year 2000 BCE, that they never grew, they never changed. Societies never encountered one another and reinvented the world. And so what Frobenius was doing was to say, look, we've got evidence from these different cultural regions and vantage points that allow us to, in a certain sense, create a certain history. Frobenius was also familiar with, and probably Picasso was as well, German theories of diffusionism, which take as their primary subject a lot of, if not art, then material culture, as one is seeing the movement of one population and set of ideas to another. The main difference is that for German diffusionists, ideas could go underground for centuries or millennia and then just show up. By the time Frobenius is engaging this, the idea is that you see the evidence that is on the ground at that present moment. And I will say it was complicated for him because in Ife, he actually claimed to have found the lost Atlantis. So that would have been a case for him. And he's been rightly criticized for that, of a case where somehow the Greeks made it to Nigeria and transformed art there. But at that time, it wasn't known when these objects dated. My own argument on that, just a little bit to the side, is that Greek ideas did reach here, but by way of the Byzantines and across from the Nile over, but in a later period, the medieval period. But anyway, it's a great question.
Thank you. Alejandro de la Fuente says, wonderful lecture. One quick question concerning evidence. You mentioned several books that probably shaped his understandings and representations as exemplified by the Demoiselles. But do we know whether he owned these books? Do we have records, for instance, about his personal library? I mean, in the absence of direct evidence, how do we decide if a particular book is the one that influenced him?
Right, that's a great question and a profoundly important one. He loved books, we know that. Broussais has really discussed in important ways his stacks of books that were in his home, and Picasso was adamant that when Broussais was taking photographs of his home, he shouldn't move anything, so he had lots of books. He also had a cupboard that was very famous where he would hide things. So, for example, he was in possession of a stolen head from the Louvre that was brought to him, and this was one of the objects that was in his collection. It was later returned. So there were many things that he hid. And up until recently, art historians, and I should say actually artists rather than art historians, were very nervous about conveying the idea that they were using books. It was seen in some way to discredit what they were doing as creative artists. So we don't have actual evidence in that form of the books that he used. Interestingly enough, one of the I ended up purchasing 3 of the books by Strauss at different editions. In one of the books that I purchased, I was up well after midnight one night working, and I noticed incised in the print of the photograph were thin lines. Basically, somebody had added pornographic graffiti, added phalluses to women and other interesting things. And I looked at that, and there's actually a couple of Picasso drawings that I publish in the book that seem to me very reminiscent of that. And that was a book that I had acquired from a dealer in Paris. I don't know if this is one and the same or if it's simply happenstance. Those were drawings that were not well known until after his death. But there are many things in, I would say, the history of art that we don't necessarily know one for one that an individual had seen a work And yet, as one looks at the array of evidence, and I would say, you know, much like this work, I probably would not have done it with one book. I probably would not have done it with two books, but by the time you've got four, then you begin to realize, and particularly when you have some of his notebooks where he's engaging with imagery from the two of them in such striking ways and in the same notebook, that at this juncture, I'm pretty convinced that he had used these.
Thank you. An anonymous attendee asks, at the beginning, you mentioned fair use. When you claim fair use for your books, do you license the images from museums or other rights holders?
So fair use is something which has been, I'm glad the question came up. It has been something which has been advocated strongly by the National Association of Artists and art historians and museum groups as well. It is a legal framework that allows you to use these images under certain conditions without getting the rights either from the museum or from the artist or from another source. And you have to be very careful about it. So the three criteria are, and this is in part which took such a long time, and I engaged attorneys, one of whom worked pro bono and another one helped me. I actually took out insurance on this as well, and got a press who was willing to do it. Duke University Press, Yale will do it, Duke will do it, MIT will do it as well. But the three criteria are: one, you have to use the best possible available image of the work. And number two, you have to cite it correctly. Give the, the correct information on it. And number three, you have to add new content, new information to that work. So for example, anytime I'm putting together, in this case, a Picasso work and another work in a new way, then I am adding content and information to it. It's in essence a means of framing things around the importance of educational use for these kinds of situations. One could not use it if I wanted to make a shopping bag and put Les Demoiselles on it. That would not work, and a number of other things. But the College Art Association, CAA, is strongly advocating to do this. And it was a decision that was made in concert with museums. So they are on board. They have to pay the same incredibly expensive rights as anybody else. And in this case, I literally could not have published the book without it, because I needed to get, for the Artists' Rights Association, I needed to get the exact number, the size of the images, the exact, whether it's going to be color or black and white or any number of things that frankly Duke was not able to produce until I had finished the manuscript and turned in all the images. So they weren't going to be able to tell me, is this going to be a quarter page or an eighth of a page or a half page? Will it be color or black and white or whatever? So at a certain point, I realized I could have taken out a GoFundMe. It would have been that expensive, but I also realized that that would not have helped, that I simply would need to do it this way. And I felt, as a senior scholar in the field and somebody who is a political activist and as a former president of this association, I felt, and someone with tenure, I felt that it really made sense for me to take this on. And I hope others will do it as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Harmon Siegel asks, how do you think about the methodological mismatch confronting historians between Picasso as an individual about whom so much is known and the makers of the African works that influenced him?
I would say that the mismatch is more interesting and a little bit more complicated than that. Simply that for Picasso's Demoiselles, I mean, I could spend the rest of this year citing and going through all the literature that's been written on Les Demoiselles, and it was wrong. in my view. I mean, they're simply, they had not looked at it closely. So we can, and you know, I think that that's often true, that sometimes one can have way too much data and it prevents one from looking closely. On the other hand, and what's interesting about this question in part is the major book that I had published previous to this, which was on the brilliant site of Ile-Ife at the Yoruba site in Nigeria. There was not one published anything on that site from the period in which these works were made, which is the early 14th century. There was nothing. The closest was a Muslim traveler in Mali who, there are like 6 or 7 words in this travelogue from a little bit after this, 1375 versus, let's say, around 1300, in which he says the most dangerous place in West Africa is this kingdom where if you go, you'll be eaten alive or something like that. But that was it. And yet out of the works themselves and out of interviews with local priests and leaders and others, I was able to write, again, a massive tome on them, just looking at the richness of the culture and the richness of the artwork. So to blame, I think, for the lack of information on African artists, they certainly exist in Africa. And I think certainly since the 1980s, we've been very cognizant of the need to add names to artists and to make sure that we collect these. But again, it goes back to the legacy of bias against Africa. I would say post the slave trade, where it's very difficult to engage in something like the slave trade without totally denigrating the populations at play. And one of the things that gets lost intentionally in this transformation is you don't view these populations as people. They don't have real religions. They don't have names and identities. So nobody even bothered to collect this. And it also goes back to some of the rudiments of social science and the idea that the collectivity, the village, the lineage in Africa is so dominant, so strong, unlike supposedly in the West, where an individual invention and creativity and transformation is impossible, which is simply not true. I mean, the amount of creativity and change and dynamism in African art is made very clear anytime one goes to a museum with a rich collection, and you just go, wow, the amount of diversity is stunning. And so I think that's something that goes to this legacy of the slave trade and to the legacy of social science theory, but also is something that is really important for scholars to try as best we can to try to recoup, either by finding actual names, as in the Gu sculpture was a work of Akade Akpele Kendo, who was a enslaved individual, Yoruba of origins, brought into the Dahomey court, or otherwise. So, and at the same time, I think it's equally important to have us work very hard at forgetting some of the things we know about or think we know about things so that we can start afresh and looking at them all over again.
Thank you, Suzanne. We don't want to tire you out, but maybe a couple more questions.
Happily.
Yes, great. I'm not sure if we're not sure if you've had the occasion, one anonymous attendee says, of talking about your book in classes, but if you have, what have some of the responses been on the part of the students to your interpretation?
That's a great question, and it's how will I say, it comes to a hard lacuna in the history of this book, which I will, because I'm that kind of person, I'll reveal it to the privacy of Krishna and David, and I'm sure nobody else is listening, which is to say I'm an Africanist. So I have no right to be writing about Western art history, much less modernism. So it's a struggle, not right now. Right now in the department here, I'm now included in these discussions, but I think it's very hard for somebody outside the field to come in and write something and to have it taken as such. And I will say that, but I'll also say I'm sort of experienced enough in the field of writing to know that it takes 5 or 6 years for one's work to get known. So I haven't taught a course, let's say, on primitivism. There are other people here who are teaching contemporary art, modern art. I'm hesitant to teach a course on primitivism, I will say, because to me, the painful nature of it is that Harvard itself is in what I consider a very tough bind, where our art museum is segregated. We have Western works and Asian works in the art museum, and the African works are in the Museum of Anthropology that's under the rubric of science and culture, not art, with the zebras and the rocks and the birds and Native American pre-Columbian. And it's a very, it's a very fraught and very painful thing for me. And I know we've been working on it, but it's difficult. But I have the same thing about how do I deal with primitivism when, for me, it's such a very painful part of my own history. I went into this field really because so much that was written about African art was heinous, it was vile, it was deforming of the richness of the cultures that I knew. And yet we have this ongoing legacy. And I'll add also that in the current decolonize movement, elements of which I strongly support, decolonize the museums, I do worry that part of this is going back to a museum of whiteness, right? A museum where sub-Saharan Africa should not be shown, right, in the views of many in our museums, and should go back, while we're not doing anything, let's say, about Algeria, which was also under the French thumb, or Vietnam, or a number of other works. But even there, I think that it's important for all of us to have to engage with these works. And so I haven't taught it because I don't teach Western art, and I might. So I also think it's difficult for students to talk about the work of their professors. In some ways, I have sometimes I have them read my work, but it's I don't feel that I'm getting the same kind of critique necessarily that I might in other ways. I don't know, it'd be interesting for other people who are teachers and about how often they have students read their own work.
Thank you. Former fellow Mirelle Miller-Young says, I'm curious about whether you think Picasso embraced the kind of exoticism and pornographic gaze that was present in the work of European anthropologists, photographers, colonial administrators, and others, a kind of racialized ethno-pornographic gaze. Or do you think Picasso held an alternate view or approach to engage in African or Black women's specularized bodies towards seeing the dynamic, creative, and profound in the image of Black womanhood?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would answer it in two ways. One, I hope Mill will take a look at some of these Straat's books, in part because they offer, it's really important to look at these books as well as to read them, and not just a still image. But it's European women are also featured in these naked. And shockingly, the ages of the women are included as well. So it's kind of a virtual brothel you're looking at. And the figures that had the pornographic graffiti, I think one of them was from Spain, which adds another dimension to it. But so I think in the context of Straat's, it was women from all of these areas, although I would say that the European women were photographed in more trying to look modest. I'm trying not to convey it in my own presentation. They're trying to look more modest, I guess it would be. Picasso, but there's another side to this as well, which is interesting. Picasso was deeply fascinated with theft and stealing and appropriation, and certainly sex. And his idea of photographing Mrs. von Dongen or of sketching another model was in essence to snub his nose at the other artist, to say, I've had your woman. So I think that, and look at, I don't know, Picasso was in his early 20s in Paris, I'm sure, like other men, wherever, horny at the time, etc. And so his mind went to sex and to women and to, I'm sure, at least in his imaginary, removing clothing, etc. But I don't think in this context that it was simply differentiating Africa from the others. I think it was part of a whole. And I think that that is, again, one of these things that is particularly insightful in looking at the Straat's book, is one could see it as a whole. And I would simply add, when you combine sex with science, with art, so women in these poses, and their artworks that are included in Straat's as well, I think that goes into some part of the brain, the emotional, the intellectual, the desire, etc., that is deeply rooted. And the fact that these books went through so many editions, I think is part of the reason why we had the legacy of Nazism, and why we have, there are many other reasons as well, including eugenics, etc., and why we have movements such as the white nationalist movement here and January 6th. I think it's part of a piece of key moments in time and key books or key things that just come back to haunt us in a way that seeks to promote a differentiation of cultures, particularly at a point in crisis where for economic and other reasons, certain populations are not increasing as fast as certain other ones. And so there's a real fear of demise and a turn economically and other ways to the worst possible means of assessing the situation.
Thank you. I'll pose one final question from the audience, and then perhaps if David Weinman has any final thoughts or comments. So the question from the audience is from Casalina Navakusa. Her research focuses on the art of the Buganda region from Uganda. And she's wondering, she's focusing on the need for restitution of objects from Uganda. And do you think there are methodologies from Picasso's use of books that could be applied today when access to works is physically not possible for scholars and artists?
I think I would need a little bit more clarity on the question. What I would say is that in my view, there are a couple things here at play, thinking about avenues going forward. On the one hand, much like Zoom and much like issues of 3D modeling and scanning, et cetera, we have technologically a wide variety of new ways of engaging. I mean, I would be delighted to go into any museum with the rest of you and just walk around a work of art and find the technical means of doing that, even though we can't touch the work and we can't do that anyway. But I think there are technical ways that we can try to address this. I think also what I'm hoping going forward is that we can get much better international legal means of leasing, so that the ownership per se is certainly critical, but then there are means in which these can come back to various other contexts of display. And here I would say just two recent damaging fires, one in Brazil and one in South Africa, make it important that we not hoard, whether it's works of art or otherwise, so that one museum doesn't have the whole corpus. I mean, we need to begin thinking about sharing, and we need to be thinking about re-engagement. So I don't know specifically on the Picasso example for Uganda, but I do know that we need many more Africans who are involved in the history of art, focusing on Africa, and archaeology and other fields. And I think one of the things that we underestimate is how much the colonial era let down Africa in terms of academic training, and still today with this mindset on economic advancement only. And that same thing is happening in this country. As we see places like the University of Kansas thinking about ending the humanities. I think that we really need to be using COVID and the crisis we're in to really rethink society as a whole and everywhere, to make it far more global, engaging, and finding ways to reassess and look at things anew. And I would simply say that works of art, from my vantage point, don't really care how they're shown or where they're shown, but they want to be shown. That's my superpositioning on a work of art. And it could be shown as an anthropological object or a fine arts object. It could be shown adjacent to a modern painting or with complements from Africa or anywhere. And I would say the more that we can do this, the better. And the more that we can gain insights from these works that will carry us forward. Some will be great, some will be less successful, but that's not what matters. It is just stepping down and doing it. And here I'd simply turn to David, because I know you're speaking next. And I think what I've learned from you, David, so much over the years is what a brilliant curator you are, and bringing these things together and getting things done. And you bring these various exhibits into play in ways that allow us to see works in a new way. And you have many gifts, but that is certainly one of them.
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. I mean, one of the things I wanted to say was that, you know, for an Africanist working on Picasso, on a European artist, and I remember you gave a lecture at the Courtauld whenever it was, you know, lost sense of time at this point.
Pre-COVID, right?
Pre-COVID, anyway. And then also Cécile Froment also gave a lecture, and both of you had the younger generation of scholars at UCL and at the Courtauld really very excited about the possibilities and the opening up of this connection between Africa and Europe. And again, my colleague, I'm working on another project, Esther Chadwick, was very excited, and Nick Robbins, who's again at UCL, and they were really, you know, feeling that a new world was opening up. And I think that's really the, you know, a nice note to end the thing on, really, the fact that what you're presenting is the way forward, something that you've already, you know, moved into, and you're really creating a new world for art historians. And I think that it's if you know, sort of decolonizing means anything, it means that, I think, that we no longer are drawing the line between the two. We're seeing the coming together and the shared histories of both Europe and Africa, and of course other continents too. And I don't think this will go away. I think I have strong feeling this is going to last.
Well, that moves me no end. And I hadn't really thought about decolonizing that way. And thank you. It's great. I like that a lot. I'm going to steal it from you, David.
Thanks so much. That was great.
Well, thank you for a brilliant discussion inspired by a brilliant book. You have really helped us end this academic year with such flourish. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks.